Thank you, Wensheng. It is my pleasure to be able to introduce our distinguished speaker today, as well as the other members of the panel, as well as to give you a brief overview of the format that we'll be following in today's, I believe, in the field of anthropology. Lothar's contributions to the field are too numerous to begin to enumerate here. Suffice to say, we are very much looking forward to what he has to say on a variety of subjects today. Joining us for conversation are Chris Bay, currently the chair of the Department of Anthropology here at Mānoa, Miriam Stark, professor in anthropology at Mānoa, Rolett, also professor of anthropology at Mānoa, and myself, where I'm also based in the Department of Anthropology. What we've agreed to as panelists today is a set of 5 open-ended questions. We will initially direct those questions toward Dr. Falkenhausen. Each member of the panel has agreed to provide some commentary or response or a set of additional questions for Lothar at the end of his initial response, and then we'll open it up beyond that to other members of the panel. The idea is to keep each question set to about 10 minutes in length. That will keep us under about an hour to get through the set of questions and give us ample time for question and answer on the part of the audience. I will be moderating your questions and the discussion as need be, and so I think we'll get started. So welcome everyone, and especially welcome to you, Lothar.
Thank you.
The first question that we have for you, and this is a big one, so please don't feel that you need to answer it in its entirety, but could you describe for us and discuss for us the nature of the archaeological endeavor in China? What are its orientations, its aims, objectives, modes and methods of analysis? Because many here may be unfamiliar with them. And how and why has Chinese archaeology taken the form that it has? And maybe you can give us a sense of some of the notable achievements in recent years as well.
Well, this is really an overwhelming question, but before I start to take a stab at it, first of all, thank you all for hosting me on this distinguished panel. It's wonderful to see you all. And indeed, talk about a topic that I think is important beyond the mere confines of the archaeological discipline. Archaeology, when I talk about archaeology in this context, I try to limit myself to modern archaeology. That is to say, the academic discipline that we know under this name, which originated in Europe in the late 18th, 19th century, and which reached China in the 20th century. Of course, China has a long history of research into remote antiquity preceding this time, which has its own very interesting story, but I think we need to keep this out of the discussion today. Now, the modern history of archaeology in China is almost exactly 100 years old. Younger than for most of the other civilizations of the old world. And considering that fact, it is truly astonishing what the Chinese archaeological community has been able to achieve, in spite of course, all kinds of turmoils, historical and otherwise, that have shaken East Asia during this past century. One thing in which Chinese archaeology differs from the pursuit of archaeology of other ancient civilizations around the world is the fact that virtually all leading scholars in this field are Chinese, and that the vast majority of them are based in China, and that the language in which the scholarship is published is Chinese. This is not the case with Egyptian archaeology or Mesopotamian archaeology, or I'm afraid South American archaeology, at least not until now. But it is the way things should be. And in this sense, I think Chinese archaeology provides a role model for what I might call a decolonized archaeology that other areas of the world may strive to emulate. As a Western specialist on this field, I am very much marginal to what happens in the mainstream. My main role is to essentially introduce to the Western public the achievements of my very eminent Chinese colleagues, and sometimes throw in a remark or two of my own, and maybe participate on the margins of some field projects. But really, the place where things happen is China, and that is a good thing. Now, of course, that also determines then some of the objectives of Chinese archaeology, and it is perhaps useful to remember that at the time when archaeology got started as a modern discipline in Chinese academia, that was the nationalist period of the early 20th century, when modern-minded scholars were desperately looking for new ways of understanding the ancient past as part of modern nation building. So, and archaeology has always fulfilled this role and has it to this day. This also explains very generous and continuous government sponsorship of archaeological work. It also, to some extent, explains a rather close relationship between archaeology and historiography, the study of Chinese history, closer than in some other areas of the world. So rather than being part of anthropology, as is the case in the United States, archaeology typically in China, there are some exceptions, is taught in history departments or in its own department, which is usually rather close to a history department. That also makes sense in the considering that China does have a long history, and many of the materials archaeologists bring to light belong to historically recorded periods. On the other hand, of course, archaeology as the study of material cultural remains and not of texts it requires a separate methodology from that of textually based history, and that fact is sometimes overlooked. That makes for a special flavor in the Chinese scholarship on the topic, something that those of us who are trained, for instance, as anthropologists, sometimes need to take some time to get used to. So rather than detailing the notable achievements of the field in recent decades, which are too numerous to enumerate, I think I'd better stop here and give some time to other participants to pronounce themselves on this very important and diverse array of issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Lothar. Chris, would you like to follow up, since your background is in Pleistocene period archaeology in Eastern Asia? You may have some different thoughts or some relevant thoughts to provide.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Lothar, for opening up with this. This is actually a really long discussion, and as you know very well, that we can have this conversation for a very long time. So, it's interesting because paleoanthropology, which is where I do spend most of my time, also has origins going back in China about 100 years, right, with the Zhuge excavations initially. You know, because China has had a very nationalistic, you know, strength, you know, in terms of its upbringing, and you know, paleoanthropologists have long tried to push the history of China way back into deep prehistory, right? Think linking Zhuge Peking Man, right? Peking Man from Zhuge locality 1 into Zhuge Upper Cave and then eventually into modern Chinese. So they've traditionally made that argument to say that we have a really, really long, deep history that goes back way back in time. So it is interesting to see, you know, and to see that from that perspective. That's the traditional mindset, right? One of the questions that's come up though is, you know, has it actually changed in my particular field? And it is interesting because when you talk to geneticists, and I work with some geneticists, geneticists seem to be quite open-minded that maybe things didn't originate in China. And, you know, China, as we know it today, actually has a much more recent origin, right? For a long time, biological anthropologists, you know, who study human fossils, they also made the argument that you can make the link from Zhuge locality 1 to Zhuge Upper Cave to modern Chinese today, right? But they seem to be coming off of that end of the spectrum now and to be more open-minded as well about, you know, maybe the China as we know it today may actually also be a little different. And there's a lot more variation that we're seeing. Some of you or many of you may be familiar with the recent news a couple months ago about the recent publication of Homo longi, right? Homo longi, Longi, that was found in northeast China after sitting in a well for about 80 years, right? You know, there's a long history there, but when you look at that as a really, I don't know if any of you guys have actually seen the fossils or the pictures of the fossils, but that is a really well intact fossil. You know, I spend a lot of time working in caves, and we find a tooth and we're really happy, right? But this is almost a complete skull that they actually found. It is an amazing find. The problem though is the context. You know, it was found in a well, so they don't really know exactly where it came from. So they don't really know how old it is. So it is really interesting that the Chinese, they said that everything originated from Peking Man, but now you're starting to find much more variation, and they seem to be open to that amount of variation. And so the archaeologists, though, I also spent a lot of time working with archaeologists, and they seem to be more open, but they are slower to transition to this. And so you still see publications even published today by some Chinese archaeologists where they still wanted to have this regional continuity in terms of their behavior going back from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic to the Bronze Age and into the recent times, because they really want to push back their culture history as far back in time. So it is interesting to see the variation even within anthropology when you're talking to geneticists and you're talking about skeletal biologists, and then you're talking to archaeologists working in China. And probably the other major difference that I'm seeing as well is, and I think Barry and Christian can also speak to this, is that there's a greater push to publish in English, and so. All Chinese researchers that I know, at least in the areas that I work in, they all want to publish in English, and so it's become a real publishing in Chinese is okay, but it's not as important, and they don't get the promotions or the jobs if they don't publish in respectable journals in Western journals. So it is really changing. So you're going from 50 years ago or even 20 years ago when everybody was publishing in Chinese, but nowadays, the much more important stuff is actually coming out in English. So it is a difference between a change and an evolution in the field itself. So.
Thanks, Chris. I'll jump in here in the interest of time. Do either of our other panelists want to contribute to that particular topic, or should we move on?
I'd like to say something just quickly, and anyone who's been to China has probably, hopefully, noticed this, and I'm sure that the others on our panel have also noticed it, but I've been working in China for about 20 years in Fujian. When I first went there, the provincial museum, which included the Archaeology Institute, was an old wooden building. And in 2003, they tore that down and they built a museum, which is the envy of most cities or universities in America. And it was just astounding to me, and so impressive at how willing and generous the government, the Chinese government, including the provincial government, then has been in supporting and sponsoring archaeology.
Thanks, Barry. We'll move on to our next question so we don't get too behind. Put Lothar back in the hot seat for a moment. Lothar, how does archaeology serve as a window into the workings of modern China? And I would say that is what light does archaeological practice and discourse shed on concerns of contemporary relevance to the nation and its people?
That's a really great question. And in fact, I think that is very key. One cannot pretend to be a bookworm and treat Chinese archaeology as completely divorced from what is going on in China today. And in my 40 years in this discipline, I have noticed that archaeological practice or practices have changed as China developed economically. And in fact, Barry just brought up the Fujian Museum, which is a good example of a general trend towards an ever more contemporary and also ever more lavish presentation of the ancient past to the general public. And I still remember when that public consisted to a very large extent of foreign tourists. That's no longer the case. There's now a tremendous interest in archaeology in China as well. And archaeological travel by Chinese tourists has become an important phenomenon. Worth its own anthropological study, as a matter of fact. So there is a lot of that. There's a lot of sort of institutional connection as well through the way archaeology is set up in China. You can understand the workings of the Chinese administration at the national level, and then the provincial level, and then the local levels. You can see how information flows into various directions, and how resources are allocated. I think in that way, archaeology can serve in some ways as a paradigm for how China works. And indeed, when you study how modern China, or in particular the PRC since 1949, has been able to train and sustain a professional community of archaeologists, which may be the largest such professional community in the world, with tens of thousands of archaeologists, then this is sort of an indication of what the Chinese government can do in other realms as well. And so archaeology is part and parcel definitely of a larger picture. It, of course, is also in some ways special. It emphasizes what is, one might call it, what is glorious about the national tradition. It is something that people in China, and by extension, people all over the world can justifiably be proud of. And then, of course, as time has gone on, more and more sophisticated and more scientifically grounded methods have been introduced into the study of this extraordinary cultural heritage. And so if, 40 years ago, one might say that Chinese scholars were still using outdated methods of analysis in studying their materials, that certainly is no longer the case today. And in particular, if you go to archaeological laboratories in China now, they are the envy of anybody around here. They are totally state of the art. And in fact, in some cases, they are now trend setting. One last thing I could say on this topic is that with China's entry into the international sphere, very recently, Chinese archaeologists have also extended the scope of archaeological practice into other countries. And so there are Chinese archaeologists working in Kenya, in Romania, in Egypt now, and of course in many Asian countries as well. And that's a very good thing, not only for the countries in question who can profit from the specifically Chinese intellectual perspectives that these Chinese archaeologists can bring into their field, but also for Chinese archaeology, which as a result of this new development is developing a more international outlook and a greater, perhaps, willingness to relate and compare Chinese archaeological phenomena to those outside of China, and bring in perhaps Chinese archaeology more fully than has been the case so far into the concert of the humanities and social sciences worldwide. That's a very positive development, in my opinion.
Thank you, Lothar. Great answer. Barry, would you like to follow up?
Sorry, I always forget to press the unmute button, but sure, I'd love to follow up on that because first of all, Lothar, you may have been working in China for 40 years, but your enthusiasm still comes through very strongly, and I like that, and that's also one of the reasons that I've been so happy and feel so fortunate to be able to work in China. I was trained in Europe and America, and I worked in the beginning in Polynesia. I started my project about 20 years ago, and I couldn't have done that except that I was a visiting professor at Harvard, and I met Zhao Tianlong, who was then a graduate student, got him involved, brought him to Fujian with me to introduce to the Fujian archaeologists the idea that if you trace Polynesian origins back to their original source, there's a lot of evidence that points to not just to Taiwan, but also to the coast of Fujian. And we presented that evidence to the Fujian archaeologists, and they loved it. And I was a little bit apprehensive about what kind of a welcome I might receive, not really being able to offer them much except an outside perspective. But it was a very welcome, it was a very positive welcome. And so that launched a whole series of collaborations, which has gone on for 20 years. In the beginning, we did a number of excavations, and I just tagged along on those excavations, helped as I could. But over the years, a the collaborative research has just taken on a life of its own and really caught on. And to give you an example, just about 3 days ago, I got an email from one of my friends who's a newspaper reporter on Pingtan Island in Fujian, sending me a newspaper article with my photo on the front page and a quote which I gave them about the link between Pingtan and the possible link between Pingtan and Polynesian, Austronesian origins. She sent me this link to this article, and the gist of it is that 3 years ago, the Fujian government funded an Austronesian research center, okay, and just a few days ago, they invited the ambassadors from Tonga, Samoa, Solomon Islands, New Guinea, other islands in the Pacific. They invited them for a conference on Pingtan Island at this Austronesian Research Center, and the topic was, I think, probably mainly sort of economic and diplomatic, but using archaeology then as a way of creating this connection between the Pacific Islands and modern China, and so it just made me feel very happy to be part of this collaboration, which has gone from not just archaeology as an intellectual academic pursuit, but something which has taken on a life of its own and has something which has taken on a life of its own, and it's just very, very, very exciting. I can just see that it's part of a trend which is going to be increasing from here on.
Thank you, Barry. Do any of our other panelists want to jump in on that as well? Miriam, you're not sure.
Well, no, I thought I was supposed to talk the next one. Can you hear me okay from here?
I can, yeah.
Well, thanks. As the only person on this panel who has never worked in China, I've only ever visited China. I love going to China. It's a lot of fun. I have to say that my earliest training in Asian archaeology was all China, in part because of where I went to school, and in part because it was only Chinese archaeology that lent itself to this kind of academic teaching, I think, outside of in an American anthropological context. So for me, Zhongguo was one of the first unifying concepts I learned in Asian archaeology. So my notion of Asian archaeology started with Chinese archaeology, and it's become a kind of touchstone for me, right? I have only taught it sometimes, but it was certainly what I learned before I learned Southeast Asian archaeology. And I want to get back to talking about three ways in which I think Chinese archaeology really contributes for me. I can't talk about having worked in China, so I'll talk about Chinese archaeology for where I work, which is Southeast Asia. And to do that, I'd like to credit Dick Gould, who early on was a member of our department and then after his retirement came back. He had a very important concept in ethnoarchaeology called argument by anomaly. And that was perhaps, I think, his most enduring contribution to archaeological theory, the idea that instead of always looking for one-to-one correlations with ethnographic analogies, what's really interesting is what doesn't fit, right? And so I don't know that Dick Gould was thinking about this when he was working, doing ethnoarchaeology with Australian indigenous peoples. But he could have been talking about Chinese archaeology because China provides this phenomenal anomaly to cross-cultural studies of just about everything. And that's so interesting. So any transformation that we teach about, knowing China makes us rethink the entire transformation, whether it's human origins, it's food production, origin of cities, origin of states. And so I think of China as being extremely important on its own, as having the earliest everything, but also just being good to think with, right? So I think that archaeologists working around the world should understand Chinese archaeology for that reason alone. And I say that because the Chinese, as Lothar pointed out back in 1993, are resolutely not anthropological in their commitment. They are historiographical. And I have the same thing in Cambodia. So I have a little bit more familiarity now. But I also wanted to say that for me, as someone working in Southeast Asia, China is also very important because it's the border. And there is no kind of line that you can draw between Southeast Asia and China. So Barry was mentioning that the Southeast coast is very important for whatever the Austronesian expansion was. That whole area of the Nanyue was extremely important. And historians are starting to write about the Dung world, right? And is that Southeast Asia? Is it China? It doesn't much matter. You see these objects going between, you see very similar descriptions of very similar southern barbarians. So China's very important for our work in that way. And then finally, China and Chinese archaeology is important because China has always been a really active agent in Southeast Asia. And so we have to always engage, not just with Chinese records, but with the Chinese. And by the 12th and 13th century, there were literally Chinese people living in Southeast Asia. And we have records by the early 13th century. So China and Chinese archaeology matters a lot to someone working in Southeast Asia. But I think even bigger than that, and one of the big contributions that Lothar and his generation have made is that Chinese archaeology really matters to anthropological archaeology more generally.
Thank you, Miriam. So we'll flip the script a little bit and ask a question of Lothar, then kind of responding to what you were talking about. And I think for many of us that are gathered here, for a Center for Chinese Studies webinar, the value of studying China on its own terms and for its own sake, it just appears self-evident to us. It's just naturally interesting. But kind of speaking to what Miriam was just talking about, Lothar, what is the value of Chinese archaeology from your perspective to the study of global prehistory, and why?
That's another one of these huge questions. Miriam has really answered it very well. From my own perspective, of course, I find the rest of the world truly mystifying. I don't have enough time to study all the other parts of the world that would be relevant to do a truly informed comparison with China. China itself is quite difficult to figure out. And from that point of view, simply studying Chinese archaeology as a way of bringing new facts to the table that decenter perhaps some of the traditional ideas about China that are enshrined in the textual record is already something that one can do, and somebody who is anthropologically trained and at least has some inkling of other cultures can contribute to that. As to the value of incorporating China into a wider frame of analysis, Miriam has made this point very eloquently. I would add to that this is also good for Chinese archaeology, because through this constant process of comparison with phenomena in other civilizations worldwide, one can hope to understand better what happened in the Chinese case. And Miriam, of course, is right that China presents all kinds of unique features that you don't find anywhere else, and which shine out even more prominently in light of such comparisons. If I have the time for just one example, one of the things that I just talked about or wrote about recently is this idea that Chinese society has a vertical lineage structure that supersedes, at least in the early phases, the importance of social classes. We don't find this in other parts of the world, where situations where the kings, the dukes, the counts, and the commoners are actually parts of the same group, related to one another, and in fact relating to one another, exchanging informations, obviously in asymmetrical ways, but within this kind of a system, rather than being hermetically sealed off from one another as social classes that do not intermingle. That is something that makes early China unique in social history, at least when compared to societies in parts of in the Mediterranean world, for instance. Linked to that is the fact that Chinese cities are a very different kettle of fish from cities elsewhere in the world. They started becoming more similar about maybe shortly after 600 BC, when perhaps there's also more contact with other parts of Eurasia, and that may not be an accident. But before that time, again, Chinese cities, even though they were large and prosperous and important, do not fulfill some of the criteria that are often mentioned as essential for fully developed urbanism, such as, for instance, monumentality of architecture. There isn't any, at least not in that early period, or more pertinent to social anthropology, perhaps, the question of a heterogeneous urban population that defines itself based on residence rather than on kinship basis. Probably not true in early Chinese cities, etc. Anyway, I shouldn't talk too long because I know Miriam will have more interesting things to say about this.
No, I just would add one point, Lothar, which is that this is what I mean about how China is good to think with. When I look at Angkor in Cambodia, class is less important than kin, and the lineage structures and the development of these networks, of elite networks, is all tied together in ways that we really don't envision elsewhere. And China is very interesting for us precisely because we have very limited records about it.
Yes.
But Christian, we haven't heard anything from you.
Oh, you'll hear from me shortly, I think.
Okay.
But in the interest of time, are there other panelists that would like to chime in? Okay, well, why don't we move forward to our next question? I just want to keep us, moving along and on target. And so, Lothar, that question is, what are the major challenges that are facing the field of Chinese archaeology moving forward? And that's really broadly construed. I'm including, diverse domains such as the design, implementation, and funding research, how information is disseminated within and outside of China, issues concerning the protection and administration of cultural heritage, and where do you think those challenges sort of arise?
Yeah, another very big challenge, both figuratively and literally. Intellectually speaking, I think the biggest challenge for Chinese archaeology is over-specialization. The enormous heaps of evidence that have been accumulated during the century or so of archaeological work in China. It is becoming less and less possible for individual scholars, even to become specialists in one period. Needless not to mention the entire sweep of Chinese archaeology. Here, the Chinese administrative system has done some good. Some of the institutions at the center have until now endeavored every now and then to publish syntheses. But these syntheses are becoming larger and larger. The one published in 1984, was one volume. The one that is currently being authoritative, well, there are 5 enormous tomes and it hasn't been finished yet. We are still waiting for 2 or 3 of them. And of course, when they come out, they will already be massively out of date. So keeping track of the evidence and making it possible to actually come up with valid conclusions from this evidence will probably impose the adoption of new computer-based techniques that my generation of scholars probably won't be able to learn anymore, but which, or at least not master fully, whereas perhaps the next generation will. Without that, and one has to hope that that this is going to be embraced. Fortunately, China is very much a modern country with a very well-developed technological infrastructure. So the conditions are there. One challenge, since we are talking about challenges, is the mentality in the minds of many archaeologists that the archaeological data are their private property. So whether they will be willing to make them available for these kinds of more comprehensive efforts remains to be seen. I hope so. I think this is something that really has to change, not only in China, by the way. The same kind of situation prevails in other archaeological communities across the world. But for China, it is particularly crucial because of the size of the country, the size of the importance of the civilization, and the amounts of material that have been found. You mentioned, of course, other sort of more logistical issues. Those are, I think, in the Chinese field more or less the same that we are facing in all other fields. I don't see anything very specific here. I just think that in China, again, the conditions are fairly good, given that it is economically prosperous. That usually correlates with governmental ability to spend money on archaeology. So far, this is not a problem. The highest leadership is obviously very interested in archaeology. And I think there's, at least at the moment, not a big challenge there. Sometimes the challenge consists in spending the research funds in a way that actually makes sense intellectually. But this is a problem one likes to have. Of course, projecting further into the future is always risky. I'm not sure what the next century is going to bring, but I hope it will bring a modernized Chinese archaeology that will be able to make full use of the enormous databases that have been accumulating. And of course, that will also be very exciting to those who have a more social scientific bent in pursuing their archaeological research. I'm looking here at Christian, who is one of the prime representatives of this this line of research with wonderful results that I greatly admire.
Well, thank you, Lother. That's very, very kind. And you've just provided me a nice glide path into my comment and questions for you too, which, I think many of us here have been, I think, have painted a picture of the field of Chinese archaeology as one in rude health. In addition to the modern boundaries of the nation today, encapsulating just enormous variety in terms of the record of human social development, which is in and of itself a remarkable thing. It has one of the largest and best funded archaeological infrastructures in the world. Archaeologists in China, highly professionalized. The pace of development just means that not a day goes by that something interesting isn't pulled from the ground and is plastered on the news. We once upon a time would lament, as I think you and others were mentioning, a kind of lack of scientific methods and rigor, sort of more modern techniques, but that's no longer the case either. That expertise is present among our Chinese colleagues at a very high level. International collaboration, non-existent, basically in the early 90s, is now commonplace. You mentioned earlier the sort of Chinese diaspora of archaeologists working around the world, and I would include Latin America there too as a place where we're increasingly seeing more of them working. And as you alluded to before, public interest in China in archaeology is so enviable. I mean, if in America we had one fraction of 1% the interest in the archaeological heritage of the places in which we live, we would be so much better off. And so, it just seems like Chinese archaeology is on the cusp of something fantastic. And because I like to play the spoiler, though, I mean, I can ask a question, and Miriam's laughing. Despite this, influx of new information and technological wizardry and information that's being pulled, from things all the time, and the overwhelming interest in archaeology, both professional and public. Have we, over the last 20 or 30 years, made great strides in understanding what happened in prehistory and with respect to China? Do we understand the social dynamics better that have given rise to many of these interesting and sometimes unique configurations, societal configurations that I think are rightly of great interest to anybody working anywhere on a wide variety of transformative problems of the kind that Miriam was alluding to. And I would say, I don't want to take all of your time, but you have written about the fact that Chinese archaeology has received very little cross-fertilization from the social sciences, and consequently, kind of the evolution of archaeology domestically in China has taken a rather different path from many other countries, one that is much more focused on, less focused on understanding social dynamics maybe, and more on the preservation and the promotion of cultural heritage. And we understand why that is. There are good sort of nationalist and other reasons for why that is, why archaeology is in service to the Chinese state. And we know what the positives and negatives are of that can be, and so we don't really need to get into it. But I do wonder if, without the benefit of that cross-fertilization from the social sciences, has Chinese archaeology sort of tilted to one, sort of further to one side than might be as healthy as we'd like to see? In the absence, with those connections between history and historiography, without the connections of social sciences and the natural sciences, excluding, Chris, your sort of Pleistocene period archaeology and the contributions that those fields have made there. Is Chinese archaeology, underdeveloped in some sense? And have we, as international scholars, not contributed to righting that ship to quite the extent that we could have? And the reason I say that is because perhaps it's a moment for our own introspection as collaborators in this archaeological endeavor to sort of ask ourselves, are we as archaeologists working in China as well versed in the social sciences as we'd like to think we are? Are we decrying something that we ourselves are not willing to embrace quite as fully as perhaps we should? And are we both sort of equally to blame? Are these two different communities of archaeological practice? Have we fallen short in some way in helping realize China's great archaeological potential to understanding world prehistory and how things came to be the way they are, and consequently not some other way? And I'll stop there, Lothar.
Well, I think I can answer the question as far as you are concerned. You have done that. in a very admirable way. I think you don't need to blame yourself for not having done the things that you mentioned, because you have done them and your team has done them. And I think there have been ripples from that into the Chinese archaeological community, which you can see in the Chinese literature on the subject. And that's not stopping now. That's going forward. When applying your probing questions to my own work, there you may be onto something. My work probably does suffer from less of a social science sophistication than would be desirable. I've often felt that on myself. On the other hand, I've followed my own intellectual inclinations and done what I could along those lines. But certainly the students I'm training are quite different, at least some of them, from that. I think what we all would like to see, this greater openness towards social science approaches in archaeology is happening, is going to happen, maybe more slowly than what we like, but archaeology is, by its very nature, a slow science. I recently conducted an experiment and went back to my dissertation project, which I hadn't worked on at all for 25 years, and just looked at what had come out of the ground within the last 25 years to see whether there had been any point of doing all this work, whether there had really been new insights into, in this case, the study of early Chinese musical instruments. And you can look at it in two ways. You could say the glass is half empty. Well, there are still many things that we didn't know in 1993 that we still don't know. On the other hand, certain incremental issues have been resolved. Or, in fact, some mistakes that I had made 25 years ago have been corrected by evidence. I mean, 25 years ago, in some cases, I couldn't have known what is now very clear. And I proposed scenarios that were simply not correct in light of present evidence. But certainly, the new evidence is worth something. And of course, it can also be used to address all kinds of other issues that 25 years ago didn't even occur to us. So I think there is progress happening. The progress is perhaps less in the realm of the social sciences than in the natural sciences. There is a lot more happening. There's a great deal more, and that's sometimes not unproblematic, because the most advanced natural science techniques are applied not only to archaeologically provenienced data, but also to looted materials. And that raises all kinds of moral hazards that we here probably are more sensitive to than some of our colleagues in China. But I shouldn't talk too much.
Thank you, Lothar. I know we're of course eating away at the time, but do any of our other panelists want to chime in with respect to that question?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on Lothar's last comment about not working with natural scientists. As many of you know, most of my work is multidisciplinary, and I think maybe that had something to do with Chinese deep prehistory, Paleolithic research, or paleoanthropology being more open to being involved with working these bigger collaborations with different scholars from all around the world. There are many different research projects going on in China that involve people from places like a lot of the big museums around the world, the Max Planck Institutes in Germany, all over the place. So that is actually one of the advantages for people that work in my field from that perspective.
Anyone else want to chime in?
I just wanted to say, maybe Christian, you're being a little too hard on the field, because I think about just the sheer scale of work that's being done and also the pace at which it's being done. I tend to look at the glass half full, and it seems to me that 20 or 30 years from now, Chinese archaeologists will have gone in so many directions we can't predict now, including social science ones, that we're still in this fundamentally descriptive phase. And maybe that sounds somehow inferior, but I feel that way very much working in Cambodia and in Southeast Asia. We have some cool stuff we find. We have some cool early hominins. We have cool this, cool that, cool cities. But so little work has been done. And so for us to make major contributions as Southeast Asians is going to take us a long time. Some of us invest a lot of effort in trying to build those bridges to show how the small amount we know now is useful. But I think with China, the scale is so big and it's so heterogeneous that we will continue to see contributions coming out as long as there's a free flow of ideas and people back and forth. That's my biggest concern. I was very optimistic about the Shanghai Archaeology Forum and all the kinds of collaborations. And I'm a little concerned now about what's going to happen, at least in the short term, about collaboration between Chinese archaeologists working within the country and those working outside. I don't know if we have time to go there.
Well, I think you've just led right into really our last question, which is really for everybody on the panel before we segue into audience questions, and there's quite a few of them that have been submitted, so I want to leave time for that. But it seems that we're trending into thinking a little bit about prognosticating a little bit about what the future of the field will look like. And what are the directions that we anticipate the field of Chinese archaeology moving in 10, 15, 25 years? What are the questions? What are the driving not just questions but issues and perspectives and approaches that we would like to see happen or see furthered, continued in some way that are already present. So I'll ask that to you first, Lothar, and then we can open it up to everybody.
Yeah, I think some has already been said on this, but I would certainly hope that Chinese archaeology in 10 years will have more systematically gathered bodies of evidence, such as you are bringing together in the Chinese Northeast from all kinds of places in China, so that social science questions can be asked and answered in a more informed way. One also hopes, of course, for the current international outlook to continue and to expand. I think the biggest challenge in that respect right now is not the political situation, but simply speaking, the pandemic. Once that is over, I hope we can return to normalcy. And in fact, I think we archaeologists, since archaeology, well, of course, it's not completely divided from the rest. We've talked about that, but it is still relatively far away from day-to-day politics. We can perhaps, play a role in keeping the networks of communication going, at least in as much as archaeology is concerned. That at least while the pandemic is still going on and we can't actually physically go to China or host our Chinese colleagues. I do think that we need to make sure that our students are properly trained in the language, and that's always a struggle because time to degree limits are being more and more strictly enforced, so there's less and less time for that. But without that, they can never fully participate in the discourse that is going on in China. That discourse will be more and more modernized, away from the traditional historiographical orientations. Both of you, Miriam and Christian, you have referred to my 1993 article on that topic, which I'm happy to hear that people are still reading. But of course, it's been superseded by more recent developments in some respects. For one thing, I mean, young students in China no longer have the level of classical Chinese that my contemporaries have and had, and so they are no longer able to indulge, at least not at a high level, in this kind of historiographically determined archaeological scholarship that I was criticizing in that article. Instead, they are going into the direction of science, which includes natural science and social science. So there is certainly one way in which Chinese archaeologists of the younger generations are going to be more similar in some ways to their contemporaries coming out of the West. But those contemporaries still have to be able to talk to them in Chinese. Yes, there will be more publication in English, but I would still think that the bulk of the material, and especially the archaeological reports, will continue to come out in Chinese and in Chinese only. So we shouldn't expect for computer translation and anything like that to make this more available. We really have to bite into the sour apple and learn the language. And that's always going to make it a little more difficult to study Chinese archaeology than, for instance, the archaeology of English or, dare I say, Spanish-speaking countries.
Agreed. Other panelists, thoughts? Okay, well, in the interest of time, I've got a never-ending accumulation of questions here from the audience that I'd like to pose to you, Lothar, as well as the rest of the panelists. The first one I have is from James, and it goes like this. Is the Chinese government continuing to work on the existence of the Xia dynasty? What are the latest developments in substantiating the validity of the Xia?
That's something I'm not quite aware of. I don't think the Chinese government is working on this. It's Chinese scholars who are interested in this. And I mean, to the extent that the Xia is a label affixed to a certain period of Chinese archaeology, Chinese history, that period certainly happened. How to fill it and whether there is a Xia dynasty to fill it, that's a question on which some scholars are still agnostic. Some people are, including my late advisor, Casey Zhang, thought that there probably was such a thing, although it probably wasn't very large territorially. So far, there are numerous archaeological discoveries that could fit this bill. I have my own personal favorite, if you really want to know. But since I'm not a Xia specialist, or not an early Bronze Age specialist, this is a layman's opinion. So I think the jury is still out there, but it is a problem or an issue that is of great interest to many in the Chinese archaeological community and also in the general public. As to what the state's opinion about this is, or whether the state even has one, I'm not aware.
Sure, and there's certainly lots of potential contenders, as you were alluding to, for this label, should the label have any meaning at all, not just say Arlito, but Shrimao, Tulsa, so on and so forth.
It's almost certainly not going to be Arlito, because Arlito, in light of recent AMS data, is too late in the day. So it's going to be something else.
Thank you. Let's see. The next question is, do Chinese archaeologists and anthropologists take into account Western developments in historical population genetics and historical linguistics? And that's coming from Ned. So that's probably one for both Lothar and Chris.
I'll leave this to Chris.
Ned, to answer your question in brief, the answer is yes. It's pretty amazing what's coming out of research labs right now in Chinese genetics, human origins research. A lot of these guys, they actually got trained in places like Max Planck Institutes in Germany. They got trained there, then they came back, and they ended up being able to set up labs in places like the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology in Beijing. They're doing cutting edge research. It is part, and this is part of the reason why biological anthropologists are making the transition to be much more open-minded about the possibility that not everything originated in China. It's the archaeologists that have been a little slower to make the transition about that. But yeah, they're definitely taking into account population genetics, and the genetics work that's coming out of China these days is really cutting edge. I cannot speak for the linguistics part of that question. Perhaps Lothar can.
I'm sorry, I don't know, but I would be very interested in this, if anybody else knows.
I don't either, unfortunately. Another question, this one actually, Lothar, I think you have something to say about from Adine, is how does archaeology in China serve as a window to the music of ancient or modern music in China?
Yes, that is something I've worked on in the past, and the astonishing thing about China is that archaeology has brought to light thousands of bronze bells that can still be played, and if they are well enough preserved, still emit more or less the same sounds that they were designed to emit. So from that point of view, one can actually reconstruct some of the timbre, some of the sound color of Chinese music. And we know from archaeological finds and also from texts what the other musical instruments of the orchestra were. And some of these are still in existence today and still being played today. So one can reconstruct the sounds. What one cannot yet do in the absence of musical manuscripts is to reconstruct the musical pieces. That we do not have. I am convinced that some form of musical notation did exist in early China, and maybe, some accident will bring to light bamboo strip manuscripts of such notations, but so far no luck. So it is up to the imagination of ethnomusicologists or archaeomusicologists to come up with pieces that sort of reconstruct the sound of the ancient Chinese music. And there are different approaches. So far, most of it sort of sounds like modern Chinese folk music, which in turn sounds like Soviet folk music, and there's a reason for that. But there are also more recent attempts to make it sound more contemporary and more exciting. There's a German-born composer who lives in Yunnan, Robert Zollitsch, now also known in Chinese as Lao Luo, who composes pieces for the carillon, for the chime bells. That is absolutely mesmerizing. If you can, I think you can listen to it online. I do recommend it.
And we have a question from Franklin. It's about provenience and ethics. So Miriam and Barry may have something to say about this as well. My question is about the use of unprovenienced materials in or coming from China. I'm thinking in particular of the Warring States bamboo texts purchased by the Shanghai Museum. but there are many others. Should we use these kinds of materials or use them only in a certain way or ignore them? Do Chinese archaeologists have different attitudes toward these kinds of materials in contrast to European or North American scholars?
Yeah, that's a thorny issue. And of course, this is handled here by people who are aware of what happens to unprovenienced manuscripts from, for instance, Iraq that have been smuggled out of the country and are now in private European collections, or for that matter, Maya ceramics with inscriptions on it that are in private collections in the United States. In which case, I think there is sort of an embargo on their usage by scholars, and there are good justifications for that. In the case of the Chinese manuscripts, I would be inclined to be a little more lenient for two reasons. First of all, they are in China. They haven't been stolen smuggled abroad. And they are well taken care of there and studied by well qualified experts as well as being exemplarily published. And the second reason is that, as the questioner already alludes, the Chinese scholarly community has no qualms about using them. And in fact, in that situation, for us Westerners coming along and impose what we consider to be best practices, which may in fact be best practices in other parts of the world, on the Chinese situation may be ever so slightly imperialistic. So I would hesitate to do that. I would, in that case, rather be inclined to follow the lead of the Chinese colleagues, and if at any point in the future they agree that these unprovenience materials shouldn't be used, then of course Western scholars should follow suit, but probably not before. Because if we do this, if Western scholars working on this material do not prohibit themselves from even looking at them, they basically legislate themselves out of the scholarly discourse, which, as I already pointed out, happens in China, and make their own work completely irrelevant. They might as well just not do it. That doesn't work. So for pragmatic reasons, I am, in this case, I'm on the side of probably using them, albeit, of course, pointing out that they were taken from archaeological contexts illegally, and that this is a deplorable situation.
Barry, Miriam, did you want to follow up? Barry looked like he was getting ready to say something. No. No. All right. Well, we're coming very close to the end of our time here. I know a couple of the panelists need to leave very, very shortly. We might have time for one more question. Let's see what we have. I can find here. One of them has to do with the extent to which research is continuing on Yangshao period communities and Neolithic communities of the East Coast of China.
I think it is continuing in a very promising way. UCLA has been involved in excavating a Yangshao period settlement in Shanxi province. By the way, we are running this as a field school, so once the pandemic is over, we hope to go back there. And if you have any students who would like to come, you are cordially welcome. It's a wonderful way of experiencing Chinese archaeology firsthand, in a way that my generation couldn't have even dreamed to do. And you would also be a part of a study of very interesting social science questions involving the nature and organization of early communities in that part of China. I know less about the Chinese coast, but I'm sure Barry can talk about that.
I think Barry just had to leave to attend his class, but I can speak for him very, very briefly and say yes, that Neolithic research continues to proceed apace on all manner of very early agricultural communities, all up through examples of early complex societal formations on into early states. So yes, it's a very vigorous field of academic research. I think I should probably thank all the remaining panelists for the time, most especially Dr. Falkenhausen for very graciously agreeing to a set of very difficult questions. You've done yeoman service, so thank you so much for that, and pass it back to Wencheng, because I know you have a few closing remarks that you'd like to make to everyone. So thank you, everyone, very much, and I apologize to the attendees that we were unable to get to some of your questions, but feel free to email the panelists, and we'll see if we can answer them for you. So thank you again very, very much for your attendance.
Well, thank you, Christian. What a lively and stimulating discussion to jumpstart our exciting CCS events this academic year. Unfortunately, our time is up. A big mahalo to all our speakers today for joining us and for sharing with us your fascinating research and expertise. And many thanks as well to our audience for submitting so many interesting comments and questions. We'll send out a brief survey to our audience later, and we would appreciate if you can take a minute or two to give us some feedbacks. Also, allow me to remind you that we have another event coming up this Friday at 10 a.m., focusing on U.S.-China relations in a COVID world. Related to COVID, we have another event scheduled on September 29th on reading and translating Fang Fang's highly controversial Wuhan Diary. We hope you can join us again and again. See you next time.